In the dim glow of a buzzing neon sign, the gas station feels like a crossroads of all walks of life. Cars hum quietly as people pump their fuel and shuffle between aisles of the small convenience store. Here, amid the ordinary humdrum of a routine evening, destiny takes an unfathomable turn. A sleek black car pulls up to pump number 3. From it steps a woman of undeniable elegance, her posture straight, her hair tied neatly back, the tailored blazer she wears subtly hinting at authority. Her name, as we later discover, is Victoria Mason. She scans the area, paying no mind to the curious glances she receives. As she walks into the store to turn on the pump, a murmur behind her builds a subtle yet pointed sound that begins to swell. "Hey, somebody check her out!" a gruff voice says, just loud enough to be overheard. Victoria doesn't flinch. She's accustomed to sidelong glances and hushed conversations following her presence in certain settings. But this time, she senses something different, sharper, heavier. As she emerges from the store, reloads her pump, and begins filling up her car, the murmurs transform into action. 2 police officers approach. Their steps, deliberate and synchronized, click against the pavement. One is young, nervous, his fingers brushing against his holstered taser. The other is hardened, older, his face etched with distrust and authority. They slow to a stop just a few feet from Victoria. "Ma'am," the older officer begins, his voice stern but calculated. "We need you to step away from the vehicle." His tone suggests this is not a request. Victoria turns slowly, her gaze steady yet not defiant. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice is firm but non-confrontational. "Identification, please," the younger officer chimes in, fidgeting as if expecting trouble. "I'd like to know the reason for this." Victoria's eyes flick between the 2 men, her composure unbroken. "We've received reports about a suspicious individual matching your description," the older officer states bluntly. There's no mistaking the unspoken bias hanging in the air. "Suspicious? Pumping gas is suspicious now?" Victoria tilts her head slightly, her lips curling into a faint, bemused smile. "Or is there something else about my description that concerns you?" The officers exchange glances. The younger one's nervous energy amplifies. The elder doubles down, his voice tightening. "Ma'am, I asked for your ID. If you don't comply..." Victoria sighs quietly and reaches into her handbag, withdrawing a sleek leather wallet. "I'm cooperating," she says, handing over her license. "As you can see, everything is in order." The older officer scrutinizes the card but doesn't back off. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here this late? Do you ask all citizens why they're pumping gas at 9 p.m., or just the ones that fit the description?" Her question hangs in the air, sharp and unyielding. The younger officer takes a step back, his discomfort on full display, but the elder officer's hand drifts closer to his waistband. He's not amused. "All right, that's enough," he says. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Victoria freezes. For a second, her calm demeanor cracks, her inhalation sharp and quick. On what grounds? Failure to comply. Disrespecting an officer. "That isn't a crime," she cuts in, her voice rising for the first time. A few bystanders stop mid-pump, their heads turning toward the commotion. Phones are pulled out and cameras begin to roll, but the officers are undeterred. Before Victoria can object further, the older officer grabs her arm and twists it behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs snaps against her wrists. "This is an abuse of power," she exclaims, her voice cutting through the dull hum of engines and murmuring onlookers. Her protest is firm but remains dignified, showing no tears, no wild screams, just controlled outrage. As the officers guide her toward the squad car, she locks eyes with the gathering small crowd. The camera phones continue to record, their lenses capturing the unmistakable look of someone wronged yet refusing to cower. In the squad car, Victoria is silent. The officers chatter among themselves, their tones dismissive and smug. "Just another entitled type who thinks they can do whatever they want," one of them mutters, his voice carrying a tone that underscores the weight of their biases. Hours later, Victoria sits quietly in the holding cell, her immaculate appearance now slightly disheveled but her composure unbroken. Each passing moment sharpens her determination. When the duty officer finally calls out her name for release, it's with a hint of confusion at the sudden change in protocol. A nameless phone call, urgent and insistent, has expedited her release. By the time she steps into the chilly morning air, a single thought guides her steps. "They'll understand who I am soon enough." The next day, in a courthouse bordered by American flags and solemn granite pillars, the very same two officers stand beside their precinct's legal counsel. Routine hearings and motions make up the docket. Nothing unusual until the seated judge excuses herself and a tall figure steps into the room. The courtroom gasps in unison as Victoria strides to the bench, her judicial robes flowing regally. Her gaze is as unflinching as it was at the gas station, but now it is clouded with something deeper justice waiting to be served. She settles into her chair and scans the room until her eyes land on the officers. She speaks for the first time since entering. "I believe we are ready to proceed." In the stillness of the courtroom, the air seems to thicken, every gaze anchored on Victoria as she settles into the judge's bench. The officers, who just hours ago were puppeteers of their perceived authority, have now become unwelcome actors in an unfolding drama they can no longer control. Their shift from smug to pale-faced nervousness is impossible to ignore. Clearing her throat subtly, Victoria adjusts her robes, her hands clasping together as she looks over the assembled group. Methodical and calm, she acknowledges each presence: attorneys, clerks, the onlookers seated cautiously in the gallery. The gravity of the moment doesn't elude anyone, least of all the two officers whose public display of power now stands as their Achilles heel. "This court is in session," Victoria announces, her voice commanding yet controlled, carrying across the chamber in a manner that further silences the whispers that dared to linger. But her composure, though outwardly steel, is a precarious tightrope. Her pulse quickens ever so slightly as she feels the weight of what's ahead. A chance, perhaps a rare one, to hold wrongdoers accountable, but to do so meticulously, ensuring not a hint of personal vendetta taints the scales. The lawyer representing the officers, a confident middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and an air of practiced defenses, rises to his feet. "Your Honor, if I may," he starts, but Victoria lifts a hand with graceful firmness, silencing him mid-sentence. "Not yet," she says. "I'd like to hear from the defendants before any motions are presented." A murmur ripples through the room. Her intention clear: the officers would not be shielded behind their counsel this early. They'd speak first or face the court's disapproval for withholding their own testimony. It's an unusual move, but one well within her rights as presiding judge. The older officer swallows hard, his earlier bluster conspicuously absent. The sharp lines of his face seem to have softened, not with remorse, but with the jarring realization of being on the defensive. "Your Honor," he begins, his voice steadier than expected. We were merely doing our jobs. There had been reports." "What reports specifically?" Victoria interjects, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Be precise. The same precise care you should have applied during your actions last night." Her tone never rises, but the weight of her words lands keenly, like a gavel striking wood. The younger officer fidgets uncomfortably. His palm finds the edge of the table, gripping it as if bracing himself. It's clear he hadn't anticipated being in this position so soon after the quiet camaraderie of their patrol car. Now, nothing about the courtroom feels forgiving. "Well, a call came in about someone loitering near that gas station," the older officer continues, though his words hold little conviction. "Given the time of night and the suspicious movements or the matching description you referenced," Victoria interrupts. Her words are delicate, deliberate, yet sharp enough to slice through weak excuses. "Officer Connors," her address of him by surname carries a noticeable weight, as though pulling rank not by his badge, but by sheer righteous authority. "Explain clearly which factor justified your subsequent actions, including the arrest made without substantive cause." Connors stiffens, momentarily flustered, before glancing at his partner. His pause is noted by everyone present, an unspoken admission of faltering confidence. The younger officer, perhaps desperate to salvage the moment, shoots to fill the silence. "If I may, Your Honor, we didn't want it to escalate. We thought it best to escalate?" Victoria echoes, eyebrows slightly raised. "By cuffing and detaining a woman whose only act was pumping gas? Did her tone, presence, or compliance exhibit any genuine indications of hostility or risk? Or are we to assume the color of her skin alone carries such weight?" Her voice sharpens discretionally impersonal, yet each syllable lands like a blow. A hush falls over the room. Even breaths seem to steady, as though the collective weight of the courtroom shifts to observe the officers in stark relief. Connor's partner attempts to interject again, but Victoria raises her hand. "Enough. This is not a debate forum. This is a court of justice. She briefly pauses for emphasis before continuing, "In my chambers last evening, I reviewed both witness testimony and footage submitted. Thanks to modern technology, your behavior was not cloaked in the protection of anonymity or unchecked authority, and what I observed leaves much to be explained." The realization settles over Connor's features like a storm cloud. Eyes around the room dart from Victoria to the officers, back to Hera Judge wielding not just power, but undeniable truth. Before either officer can muster a retort, the courtroom door creaks open. All eyes shift. A representative of Internal Affairs steps in, papers tucked under one arm, their stern demeanor suggesting an urgent intention. Victoria doesn't react outwardly to the movement, though inwardly she recognizes what this means. Reinforcements for the pursuit of accountability. With a calm expression, she turns back to the officers. "You'll find," she begins, "that justice operates differently here. Commands are not barked nor respect coerced, regardless of uniform, status, or title." The officers exchange discomforted glances as the Internal Affairs investigator approaches the bench, presenting papers that Victoria promptly reviews. She takes her time, scanning each word before lowering the documents and glancing at the defendants again. "These hearings will resume shortly," she states coolly, "but understand this: every action carries consequence, whether at a gas station or seated in this chamber. Reflection and repentance may guide what follows. I suggest you use the time wisely." Her words hang heavy, echoing just as the courthouse clock strikes the hour, a sound that reverberates beyond the walls, as if bridging the clash between injustice and the inevitability of reckoning. For now, the next move rests with the system's fragile balance and those at its mercy. The courtroom resumes after a short recess, and the atmosphere has only grown denser in the interim. The officers, Connors and his younger, less experienced partner, Officer Taylor, return to their seats, their movements subdued, their confidence seemingly siphoned by the gravity of the situation. Aware of how public this matter has become, they exchange words and whispers, but their discomfort is impossible to miss. Victoria Mason re-enters the chamber, her face a mask of composed resolve, betraying neither triumph nor fatigue. She heads directly to the bench, her movements poised and deliberate, embodying the clarity of her authority. The brief recess provided more than just logistical adjustment. It allowed time for reflection and, perhaps, anxiety to stew amongst those under scrutiny. The murmuring among the gallery attendees ceases instantly as she raises the gavel. A sharp knock silences the remaining voices in the courtroom. "This court is now back in session," Victoria announces, her tone as resolute as ever. She momentarily surveys the room, her gaze passing over each face with quiet, piercing intention. Her judicial bearing commands immediate attention, and there's no mistaking the expectation she holds for what comes next. A representative from Internal Affairs, a tall, immaculately dressed figure named Agent Harlan, rises from their seat near the gallery. With a brief nod from Victoria, they approach the bench. "Your Honor," Harlan begins, their voice even but firm. "As agreed, we've reviewed the evidence presented thus far, including the video footage from bystanders and the officers' own body cams." The statement hangs in the air momentarily, a precursor to the revelations that follow. A low murmur ripples through the onlookers, but Victoria silences them with a glance before gesturing for Harlan to continue. "What remains evident is this: there is no legitimate cause for the detainment or treatment inflicted upon Miss Mason at the gas station," Harlan continues. "The actions displayed indicate, at minimum, an egregious lapse in judgment. At worst, it reflects a willful misuse of authority influenced by bias. We intend to pursue further inquiries into this incident, per protocol." Victoria's expression is unreadable as she listens, though the faint tightening of her jaw suggests her frustration brews beneath the surface. She nods curtly at Harlan, dismissing them back to their seat. Gazing at Connors and Taylor, she raises her voice slightly to address the officers directly. "Given the gravity of these findings, the remaining question is this," Victoria begins. "Were your actions taken in good faith as part of your duty, or were they a result of negligence or worse, prejudice? Consider your next words carefully, gentlemen, as they may carry significant consequences." Connors grips the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. Public scrutiny, potential repercussions, the embarrassment of standing before the very woman they wronged, all factors hang heavily over him. Taylor, on the other hand, shifts uncomfortably, his youth and inexperience painted across his tense demeanor. "Your Honor," Connors finally says, clearing his throat, "with respect, We acted on a report. It was late and the description we received matched Miss Mason, but the outcome wasn't intended to unfold as it did. Victoria's eyes narrow, but she allows him to finish. There were indications. Connor struggles to find stable ground that warranted verifying her identity, ensuring there were no risks. The statement does little to convince anyone in the room, least of all Victoria. Her silence weighs heavily over the courtroom before she zeroes in on Taylor. Officer Taylor, she addresses him directly for the first time. You are visibly less seasoned than your partner here. Naivety is not an excuse, but negligence can often be compounded when authority remains unchecked. Do you honestly believe your actions that night reflect adherence to protocol and duty? Taylor hesitates, swallowing hard. The room hangs breathless, awaiting his reply. Your Honor, he says at last, his voice barely above a whisper, I followed instructions. I didn't mean to offend or escalate. Victoria leans forward, her stare pinning him in place. And yet escalate you did. How many times did Miss Mason explicitly comply without hostility, aggression, or disobedience? How many signs pointed to her being more than cooperative under undue pressure? Taylor's shoulders slump slightly, his silence damning. Connor shifts uncomfortably, his own defenses crumbling under the weight of the evidence and the judge's relentless inquiry. Before either officer can formulate a proper response, the door to the courtroom opens, drawing every eye. A young man enters, flanked by attorneys who carry an unmistakable air of intent. The attorneys exchange a brief nod with Victoria, then approach the bench to present a stack of documents. Victoria reviews the papers quickly yet thoroughly, her expression becoming more resolute with each passing second. Once finished, she looks up not at the gallery or the attorneys, but directly at the two officers. These, she says, her voice sharp and deliberate, are sworn affidavits from witnesses at the gas station, as well as formal complaints lodged against your conduct in previous incidents. Complaints that, until now, remained buried within a system designed to protect its own. The revelation draws an audible gasp from the gallery. Connor stiffens further, his confidence now all but eroded, while Taylor looks downright shell-shocked. Victoria sets the documents down and clasps her hands together firmly. This court will adjourn until tomorrow, she declares, her tone brooking no argument. But let me make something abundantly clear. Both public servants and the system they serve are accountable to the very citizens they are sworn to protect. You operate under the law, not above it. The silence returns as she rises, signaling the end of the session. As she steps away from the bench, the tension in the room escalates once more, not from her departure, but because of a lingering realization. The officers are caught in an inexorable tide, and the storm hasn't yet peaked. And just as Victoria nears the exit, her parting words echo back through the stifled courtroom. Tomorrow will offer clarity or conclude consequences. The choice is, and always has been, yours. Victoria Mason sat in her chambers as the light from the courthouse windows bathed the room in a golden hue of the setting sun. The morning's events were a whirlwind of tension and revelation, and while she maintained her poise in the courtroom, behind closed doors, the weight was palpable. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly massaging her temples as she processed the statements, the body cam footage, and the damning affidavits. Her role as both an arbiter of justice and the victim of grievous misconduct placed her in a unique and precarious position. The knock on her door was succinct but firm. Agent Harlan didn't wait for an invitation before stepping in. Your Honor, Harlan began, setting down a stack of case files on Victoria's desk. These are additional reports on Officer Connors and Officer Taylor from the precinct. Prior incidents, internal complaints, they paint a picture that isn't pretty. Victoria silently reached for the files, her eyes scanning the pages with methodical precision. Her expression remained stoic, though with each paragraph, the strain became more evident. Years of complaints, she murmured, but no disciplinary action. Her tone was flat, yet the undertone of disbelief was unmistakable. Unfortunately, the precinct's oversight or lack thereof has allowed this pattern to persist, Harlan added. Their voice carried a note of frustration. No accountability, and in cases like this, Victoria finished the thought, her voice a mixture of steel and weariness. Emboldened behavior. She closed the file sharply, her gaze piercing as it met Harlan's. We must be meticulous in our approach. Anything short of due process diminishes the very justice we're seeking to uphold. Harlan nodded, respecting the judge's resolve. Understood. But you should know there's growing media attention outside the courthouse. This trial is no longer restrained to this chamber. "Miss Mason, it's becoming a lightning rod." Victoria smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Justice isn't served behind closed doors, Agent Harlan. Sometimes you need the world to see it unfold." The clock on the wall ticked with an audible urgency as the courthouse resumed its proceedings. By the time Victoria re-entered the courtroom, the once hushed atmosphere now buzzed with a low murmur of expectation. Reporters had trickled in, their pens and cameras poised to document every detail. In the gallery, familiar faces of community members and activists sat with a mixture of somber solidarity and simmering indignation. Connors and Taylor sat stiffly at the defendant's table, the pressure mounting as their situation became increasingly untenable. They exchanged brief, strained whispers before falling silent. They could see the growing crowd, the raised eyebrows, and worst of all, the bruising weight of the affidavits Victoria had revealed earlier. As soon as the gavel struck the bench, however, all focus returned to Victoria. Her presence was commanding, her every word laden with purpose. "We will now continue examination of the testimonies," she declared. "But before we proceed, I must remind this courtroom of one critical principle: dignity. Regardless of the charges, the courtroom must remain a place where justice speaks, not anger." Her words quelled some of the tension in the gallery, though their intent clearly carried across to everyone present. Victoria gave a slight nod to the prosecutor, who promptly rose to resume questioning Officer Connors. "Officer Connors," the prosecutor began, his tone crisp and pointed. "Previously, you stated that Miss Mason's matching description raised concerns prompting your approach. Can you specify exactly how her behavior, appearance, or actions constituted reasonable suspicion?" Connors hesitated again, his polished answers unraveling under scrutiny. "She was loitering. Gas stations at that hour often transact what, officer?" The prosecutor quickly interjected. "Do you mean purchasing gasoline?" The laugh elicited from someone in the back gallery immediately drew stares, since employees simply de facto do demonstrate where, however public, would alloy systematic case to delicate its implications. Pause suggest Victoria's. Actions official. Source trailed public complex. Momentown proceed protocol. Neutral. Both in force, Victoria Mason's gavel slammed down with a decisive crack, pulling all eyes back to the center of the courtroom. The tension was palpable, stretching taut between those seated on either side of the grand chamber. Victoria leaned slightly forward, her hands clasped in front of her, and fixed her gaze on the two officers, Connors, now visibly drawn, and Taylor, his youthful face shadowed with unease. "Before we proceed with the testimony, I want to remind you both," Victoria began, her voice calm but resolute, "that your presence here is not merely the result of protocol. As public servants, you swore an oath to uphold the law impartially. This courtroom represents the very principle that no one, not even those in uniform, is above the law." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, before she gestured to the prosecutor. Repositioning his notes, the prosecutor resumed questioning. "Officer Connors," the voice of the prosecutor carried, clear but precise, "you've repeatedly emphasized that your actions were based on protocol. Can you explain why you opted to escalate to handcuffs rather than pursuing a less aggressive course of action? Specifically, what part of your training informed that decision?" Connors cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. For the first time, his stoic demeanor cracked ever so slightly. The situation appeared tense. He began hesitantly, searching for controlled rationale. "With respect, Your Honor, we believe there was a potential threat, given the time and the description provided in the report." Victoria's expression didn't waver, though her silence seemed louder than any rebuke. The prosecutor was quick to follow up. "A threat? Miss Mason was unarmed, compliant, and cooperative by every witness account and recorded footage from your own body cameras. What aspect of her demeanor did you interpret as threatening?" Connors opened his mouth but faltered. The weight of evidence stacked against him was suffocating. His partner Taylor made the mistake of a nervous glance toward Victoria, whose piercing gaze shifted to lock onto him. "Officer Taylor," Victoria cut in, her voice even but firm. "As a less experienced officer, it's reasonable to assume you may have deferred to Officer Connors in this matter. However, as you've indicated, Miss Mason complied throughout the entire interaction. Was there a specific point at which you believed she posed an immediate risk?" Taylor hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No, Your Honor, I didn't see any risk." The gallery erupted into low murmurs, but Victoria raised her hand, silencing the room instantly. "Then by your own admission, no indications justified the actions taken," she stated, her words landing as solid as her earlier gavel strike. "Or did you not feel empowered to speak up in disagreement with your senior officer?" Taylor fidgeted, his silence speaking louder than the words he couldn't bring himself to form. Connors closed his eyes briefly, the weight on him intensifying. Victoria let the silence linger before nodding toward Agent Harlan, who stood promptly and approached the bench. As the representative for Internal Affairs cleared their throat, they revealed the twist no one had expected. "Your Honor," Harlan began, their voice taut with purpose, "since this investigation began, additional footage and reports have surfaced regarding incidents involving these officers. The common thread among the complaints suggests a troubling pattern: unsanctioned stops, unfounded detentions, and, in several cases, actions seemingly influenced by racial bias." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Connor's face turned the color of chalk, while Taylor appeared shell-shocked, perspiration glinting on his forehead. "This evidence," Harlan continued, "is alarming in its frequency and consistency. Internal Affairs is in the process of launching a full inquiry, but the material we've submitted today speaks for itself." They handed a thick stack of papers to the court clerk, who delivered one copy to Victoria's bench and another to the defense table, where Connors reluctantly accepted it, his hands trembling faintly. Victoria scanned the documents quickly, her expression unreadable. Then, in a measured tone, she addressed the courtroom. "These reports demand further review. This court cannot and will not overlook clear patterns of misconduct that compromise the safety of the citizens it serves. Officer Connors, Officer Taylor, are there any other details you wish to add to this record before we proceed further?" The room's silence grew deafening. Connors cleared his throat again, but when he spoke, his tone was filled less with the confidence he exuded days before and more with a quiet, defeated attempt at justification. "Your Honor, we were trying to do our job. We never intended for any harm. I didn't think it would—" His words trailed off into nothingness. Victoria studied him carefully, her expression still void of judgment but brimming with discernment. "Intent does not erase impact, Officer Connors. The harm has been done, and no badge affords immunity from accountability." Shifting her gaze, she addressed the full courtroom. "This case raises larger questions about oversight, integrity, and the systems designed to protect the public. Let it be clear, those systems will be examined meticulously." With that, Victoria stood, signaling the adjournment of the day's proceedings. But just as the courtroom began to rustle with movement, her sharp voice rang out once more, a parting statement meant to echo beyond the chamber walls. "Our justice system is built on the premise of accountability. Tomorrow, we will see where such accountability leads, not just for the officers in question, but for every facet of the structures they represent." As the heavy oak doors shut behind her, the hum of speculation and tension rose in her absence, the cliffhanger undeniable. The officers sat motionless at their table, and across the courthouse, the buzz of media cameras and murmured voices promised one thing: tomorrow would change everything. In the early morning light, the courtroom felt almost surreal. Sunlight filtered through the vast windows, streaming patches of warmth that sharply contrasted the icy tension filling the room. Officer Connors and Officer Taylor shifted uncomfortably at their table, heads occasionally bowing toward their counsel, as though whispering would make the weight of their situation disappear. The crowded gallery remained hushed, a sea of faces locked in somber anticipation. Cameras, though barred from the courtroom, had ensured that the proceedings outside became a nationwide focal point. Today, perspectives everywhere converged on this singular pursuit of justice. Victoria Mason stepped into the courtroom with deliberate steps, her judicial robes brushing elegantly across the tiled floor. As she ascended the bench, her face betrayed none of the fatigue the past days had wrought upon her. If anything, her expression reflected a hardened resolve. The courtroom, immediately sensing her presence, sank into an even deeper silence, the tension now unbroken by the quiet shuffle of papers or muffled coughs. When Victoria seized her gavel and rapped it cleanly on the polished wood, it was less an opening signal and more of a subtle declaration. No tolerance, no distraction, and no excuses. "This court is now in session," Victoria began, her voice resonating with clarity. "We continue our examination of Officers Connors and Taylor in relation to their conduct on the night in question. As always, this court is guided by law, not public opinion. However, let me reiterate, When systemic flaws are exposed, it falls upon us not just to judge individuals, but to confront the systems that perpetuate misconduct. Justice demands nothing less. The words cast a long shadow over the room. Several heads in the gallery nodded subtly, affirming the gravity of her statement. Behind Victoria, Agent Harlan sat just a few feet away, accompanied by two other representatives from Internal Affairs. Their presence, quiet but commanding, hinted at the wider investigation awaiting its own time to unfold. The prosecutor rose smoothly, his polished demeanor radiating confidence built on preparation. He made his way to the center of the courtroom, turning his attention to Taylor. There was no sharpness to his stance, just an effective but fair precision. Officer Taylor, the prosecutor started after the customary formalities. Yesterday, this court heard your admission that the events surrounding Miss Mason's detainment had, in your words, escalated. Now, I'd like you to clarify further. At what point prior to the arrest did it become clear, at least to you, that no legitimate threat existed, and why didn't you act on that realization? Taylor swallowed, the sound seeming much louder in the charged atmosphere. He avoided looking at Connors, whose rigid posture suggested someone bracing for an eruption. Taylor sighed softly before speaking, though his voice quivered with a mix of apprehension and guilt. When Miss Mason provided her ID, Taylor began slowly. It was clear she wasn't who the report described. There wasn't anything in her behavior or presence that matched what had been called in. But what, Officer Taylor? The prosecutor pressed gently, unwilling to let the confession falter. Why then did you proceed not only to question her, but to escalate the interaction? Why did you remain silent when your partner acted against protocol? Taylor's weight shifted uncomfortably, his hands fumbling against his pant leg as though for a tether of stability. Finally, with raw honesty and no small amount of shame, he said, "Because it wasn't my call. Standard patrol protocol dictated that Senior Officer Connors was in charge. I didn't think I had the authority to contradict him." The gallery groaned audibly, a low rumble of exasperation and outrage that prompted Victoria to raise her hand for silence. Once the murmurs subsided, she leaned toward the pair of officers, her gaze now resting squarely on Connors. "Officer Connors," she called, her voice sharp as the senior officer on duty, "the responsibility for ensuring your actions adhered to the law and departmental practices ultimately falls upon you. Tell this court why you felt justified in your treatment of Miss Mason, especially after Officer Taylor's revelation that there was no genuine threat." The spotlight, merciless and unrelenting, found Connors again. He cleared his throat twice before answering, his voice gravelly and defensive. "Your Honor, we did the best we could under the circumstances. Based on the information we were given and the time of night, certain precautionary measures seemed necessary." "Necessary?" Victoria's calm voice contained an edge, cutting through the defense like a scalpel. "You handcuffed and detained a woman whose only act was refusing to comply with baseless intimidation. Was her cooperation insufficient, Officer Connors? Or was there another factor influencing your approach?" The implication brought an audible gasp from the gallery. Connors' composure fractured further. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, the weight of her accusation sending ripples of panic fluttering across his face. "It wasn't about race, if that's what you're suggesting." He stopped abruptly, realizing too late that his words had created the very insinuation he wanted to avoid. Victoria let the silence linger, absorbing the tremor his words had sent coursing through the room. When she finally responded, her tone softened, but the gravity was undiminished. "Officer Connors, intent matters little in the presence of undeniable harm. You may not believe bias dictated your actions that night, but every objective factor, your reaction, your escalation, the unnecessary detainment, counts otherwise. Belief does not excuse behavior." Before Connors could stammer a reply, the prosecutor spoke. "Your Honor, given the admissions made today and the mounting documentary evidence, this court has sufficient grounds to consider formal charges of misconduct against both defendants. However, I defer to the court's guidance in these proceedings." Victoria straightened, her gaze sweeping across the room once more. "This court will deliberate preliminary charges over recess. When we reconvene, you'll find that accountability does not retreat in the face of exposure, but rather sharpens its focus. We're not yet finished here." The sound of the gavel pronounced an intermission, but the air buzzed with the promise of a turning tide, not just for the two men at the defense table, but for a system that had allowed them refuge for far too long. Victoria Mason strode into the courtroom once again, a calm energy radiating from her as she adjusted her judicial robes. Overnight, the news of the proceedings had spread like wildfire. By now, the entire city and much of the nation was watching the case unfold, waiting to see if justice would prevail. Both officers, Connors and Taylor, sat at their table, visibly more worn than the previous day. Each carried the air of someone who had spent a sleepless night reckoning with the growing seriousness of their predicament. The gavel struck, and the room fell silent. Victoria's gaze swept across the courtroom, pausing momentarily on Connors. His attempt to appear composed was betrayed by the slight twitch of his hand nervously tapping the table. "Before we continue to deliberate the evidence and testimonies," Victoria said, her voice unyielding, "this court must address the nature of accountability, not just from individuals, but from the systems that empower them. Too often, the focus is placed solely on the actions of one or two people while ignoring the structures that allow such actions to go unchecked. That ends here." The courtroom remained hushed, her words a weighty prelude to what would follow. The prosecutor proceeded to detail another piece of evidence, audio from an anonymous precinct whistleblower, handed over the night before. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the bench with urgency, "we have received audio recordings that reveal significant procedural violations within the defendant's precinct. These recordings," he held up the evidence folder, "directly call into question the culture and oversight of the department as it pertains to routine stops, particularly those involving individuals of certain demographics." Victoria motioned for the evidence to be presented. The audio was played aloud for the courtroom, the grainy sound of muffled conversations filling the air. In these recordings, officers' voices, apathetic and disturbingly lighthearted, discussed implementing unofficial quotas for stops and interrogations. Phrases like, "It doesn't matter if they're clean," "keep stopping them and it usually works," dared the room to match the casual tones with the grave implications behind them. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the recordings painted a damning picture, not just of Connors and Taylor, but of a systemic issue deeply rooted within their precinct. Connors, his head bowed, appeared to shrink beneath the withering weight of the courtroom's collective judgment. The prosecutor turned back to Victoria. "Your Honor, these recordings provide not only context but motive. While Officers Connors and Taylor are the ones on trial, they are part of a larger machinery that prioritizes statistics over justice and empowerment over duty. This evidence underscores just how necessary it is for accountability to extend beyond individuals toward real institutional reform." Victoria allowed the murmurs in the courtroom to settle before she spoke again. "Officer Connors," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "would you care to explain these tapes? Did you know of such practices, and did you, as a ranking officer, ever participate or condone them?" Connors shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usually firm posture appeared deflated as he realized the walls were closing in. "Your Honor," he began hesitantly, "I cannot deny that such conversations occurred, but participating? That's different. I always aim to follow procedures even if—" He trailed off, realizing midway through his justification that it only deepened his involvement. "Even if," Victoria prompted, her tone laced with expectation. Connors sighed deeply. "Even if the culture in the precinct encourages things that, looking back, I should have questioned. Maybe I ignored certain things or thought it wasn't my job to fix what wasn't mine to change," he admitted, his words carrying an emptiness that hinted at an internal struggle. Victoria leaned slightly forward. "Ignoring a flawed system does not exempt you from its consequences, Officer Connors. Turning away as bad practices become norms is complicity. If you allow something to persist without action, you have chosen your side." Taylor nervously glanced at his partner, his lips pressed thin. The younger officer had yet to speak in the session, but it was clear something weighed heavily on him. The prosecutor turned to face Taylor directly. "Officer Taylor, the court is aware of your inexperience, but as someone who operated directly under this system, did you ever witness or feel pressured into participating in actions or conversations that contradicted your own understanding of proper procedure?" The question hit Taylor like a lightning bolt. Fidgeting nervously, he cleared his throat. "There were moments," he began cautiously, his words coming slowly. "Moments where I knew things didn't feel right. Miss Mason's arrest being just one of them. But speaking up it didn't seem like an option. Anytime I questioned something, I got the same response. Just trust your superior and don't overthink it." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "And you accepted that justification, Officer Taylor? Knowing what you do now, Do you believe following orders is enough of an excuse when those orders lead to injustice? Taylor hesitated, his face wrought with discomfort. Finally, he muttered, "No, Your Honor, it's not an excuse. I just didn't know what else to do." Victoria nodded somberly, her quiet acknowledgement more powerful than any rebuke. "And now you do. Remember that." Her attention turned back to the gallery, where the atmosphere had subtly shifted from outrage to solemn reflection. Parents held the hands of their children, activists watched with arms crossed, and reporters scribbled down notes. The proceedings had grown larger than any individual in the room. They were now a referendum on everything the badge was supposed to represent. Abruptly, the courtroom doors swung open, cutting through the moment like a knife. A clerk handed Victoria a note, her eyes scanning it carefully before her expression hardened. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the room, "it appears new evidence has surfaced, which this court must review immediately. We will adjourn temporarily while this evidence is assessed. When we return, this room will have clarity on our next steps." Her gavel struck with finality, but the tension in the air promised that the most explosive revelations were yet to come. As the courtroom's doors opened once again, the tension that had momentarily diffused during the recess rushed back in like an unwelcome tide. Victoria Mason resumed her position at the bench, her posture firm, conveying authority and composure. The hum of muffled voices hushed into silence as the gavel struck a sound that reverberated with undeniable finality. Every pair of eyes in the room locked onto her as she raised her head to address the court. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying a tone that commanded immediate attention. "Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the gravity of where we stand today. This is not simply about one incident, one night at a gas station. It is about a pattern one that has damaged the foundation of trust between law enforcement and the communities they are meant to serve. And it is about accountability, ensuring that we do not allow injustice to fade into silence." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom, leaving a stirring quiet in its wake. Across the room, Connors sat stiffly, his jaw clenched and his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Next to him, Taylor appeared younger than ever, his face pale, his eyes darting inconspicuously as though searching for a lifeline amidst the growing sea of his guilt. Victoria turned her gaze to the prosecutor. "Proceed." The prosecutor stood with deliberate movements, a file in hand that had arrived only hours before. He addressed the courtroom with a restrained intensity that seemed well suited to the magnitude of the moment. "Your Honor, members of the court, during the recess, we reviewed the evidence submitted via whistleblower correspondence and subsequent investigations. New testimony has been secured that not only corroborates the systemic issues referenced earlier, but also implicates these two officers in undisclosed incidents that raise serious ethical concerns." Heads turned, whispers threatened to erupt, but Victoria's raised hand quickly restored the silence. The evidence spoke for itself, and the courtroom braced itself for what was revealed next. The prosecutor walked to the center of the courtroom, holding up an envelope. "Your Honor, the whistleblower has provided additional internal correspondence, not just from Connors and Taylor, but from within their precinct. It shows an ongoing pattern of targeting specific demographics under the guise of procedural stops. The most alarming revelation is the language used in these communications, which reveals clear racial bias." A visible ripple of unease traveled through the gallery while Connors shifted, his jaw tightening with every word. He wasn't accustomed to sitting on the receiving end of judgment, and his discomfort was evident. The prosecutor paused, then looked directly at Connors. "Officer Connors, do you deny involvement in these communicated initiatives within your precinct? The quotas for stops, the prioritization of numbers over substance, do you refute that these became standard operating procedures under your watch?" Connors hesitated. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, at least not quickly. Finally, he rallied a weak defense. We never formalized any quotas. We were just doing what we thought was expected of us. The administration itself, it encourages proactive patrols." His voice carried a hollow defiance, one that even he seemed to know was faltering. Victoria remained composed, yet her unflinching gaze spoke volumes. "Officer Connors," she interrupted, "expectation without accountability invites abuse. And there is no protocol that excuses the deliberate targeting of individuals based on race, appearance, or other prejudiced assumptions." The prosecutor seized the opportunity. "Officer Taylor," he called, swiftly turning his attention, "as a junior officer, did you feel pressured to conform to these expectations described by your partner? Were there explicit or implicit directives that led to profiling? Taylor's wide eyes met the prosecutor's, then flickered to Victoria. He hesitated, swallowing visibly as the courtroom seemed to lean in. His voice, thin but rising to the occasion, cracked. There was pressure, he admitted. It wasn't official, it wasn't written down, but you knew. You knew who you were expected to stop, who got questioned more often. When I tried to question it, I was dismissed, told to just follow orders. The admission sent a murmur flitting through the gallery, though it was quickly silenced by a stern glance from Victoria. Taylor's words carried the weight of truth, and that truth was heavier than many in the room had anticipated. Victoria regarded Taylor thoughtfully before she spoke. You made a choice to comply, Officer Taylor, even when you recognized the wrongness of these practices. And choices, no matter how coerced, have consequences. Then she turned back to Connors, her tone hardened. And you, Officer Connors, are not simply complicit. You are culpable. Your role as a senior officer required you to lead with integrity, yet your decisions perpetuated harm. Justice will demand answers, not excuses. The courtroom air thickened as Connors met her gaze, his own faltering. He looked not at the gallery or the prosecutor, but down at his hands, perhaps realizing for the first time just how irretrievably the ground beneath him had shifted. In a final twist, the prosecutor reached for the last piece of his prepared statement. Your Honor, with these testimonies and materials presented, we request that formal charges of misconduct, misuse of authority, and racial discrimination be brought before this court. Additionally, given the systemic nature of the evidence revealed, an external review of their precinct is not only warranted, but urgently necessary. Victoria nodded, her presence resolute. This court will review these recommendations during deliberation. For now, we will adjourn until tomorrow. The gavel struck, but Victoria's gaze lingered on the two officers as they sat entrenched in the consequences of their actions. When she finally stood to leave, the tension followed her out, and the whispers in the gallery signaled what everyone now felt. The noose of justice was tightening, and tomorrow's session promised resolutions that could no longer be denied. The next day dawned with a tension that preceded its breaking point. Outside the courthouse, a larger crowd had gathered, activists waving signs, reporters pushing for comments, and uniformed officers managing the sprawling assembly. The energy was different now. The case had grown, taking on a life far beyond the original incident. This wasn't just about Victoria Mason anymore. It had become a referendum on the unchecked power of institutions, on the credibility of those who wore badges, and on whether the system could correct itself when flawed. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a hive, the proceedings just moments away from resuming. The gallery was packed once again, seats filled early as people sought to witness justice unfold firsthand. Many had come to believe that today would be pivotal, possibly even historic. In the front row sat several community leaders, their expressions a mixture of resolve and cautious optimism. Behind them, everyday citizens jostled for a view, their whispers blending into a low murmur of anticipation. The air was charged with expectation. Victoria Mason entered the courtroom with her usual deliberate grace, her judicial robes gliding behind her like a mantle of authority. The room fell silent in an instant, the weight of her presence capable of stilling even the smallest stirrings. Taking her seat at the bench, she adjusted her papers and then scanned the gallery. There was no sign of intimidation on her face, only focus. Today, lines would be drawn more clearly than ever before. This court is now in session, Victoria said, her voice ringing out with precision. We will move forward by addressing the findings presented during yesterday's recess. As stated previously, our aim is simple yet uncompromising, to seek truth and deliver justice. The prosecutor wasted no time as he rose, holding yet another set of documents that had been submitted the night before. Your Honor, he began, new evidence has been reviewed, corroborating not just the misconduct of the defendants, but widespread institutional malpractices within their precinct. These findings, supported by whistleblowers and detainee testimonies, illuminate an entrenched culture of neglect, racial bias, and abuse of authority. A wave of muttered reactions rippled across the gallery. People exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of anger and vindication, but Victoria quickly quelled the growing noise with a firm strike of her gavel. This courtroom will remain a space for decorum, she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Continue. The prosecutor nodded and directed his attention toward the jury. Our evidence includes records of unresolved complaints, body cam discrepancies, and most damning, signed affidavits from officers within the same department. These reveal not just complicity, but active participation in orchestrating unlawful practices. Onlookers gasped audibly this time, and Victoria allowed the sound to ripple briefly before motioning for the process to proceed. The weight of the words hung heavy, each revelation tightening the noose around Connors and Taylor. Their defense attorney looked flustered, flipping through his legal pads and whispering hurriedly to Connors, whose pale, tight-lipped appearance betrayed his mounting anxiety. "Officer Connors," the prosecutor said, turning sharply, "given the allegations outlined in these affidavits, including your role in promoting certain tactics within your unit, do you maintain your earlier statements denying systemic misconduct? Do you deny that this culture existed and thrived under your tenure?" Connors tried to sit straighter, though his rigid shoulders betrayed the pressure pressing down on him. "Your Honor," he started, directing his attention to Victoria and not the prosecutor, "I'm not going to deny that mistakes were made, but mistakes weren't policies. And I never explicitly benefited or pushed any agenda involving quotas or profiling. Any insinuations that He paused, choosing his words carefully, "intentionally targeted or oppressed anyone are untrue." Victoria raised a brow, her disapproval barely concealed. "So you contend, Officer Connors, that the practices revealed in this courtroom flourished without your awareness or consent? Are you asking this court to believe that such actions took place far beneath your radar, with no oversight, no reinforcement, or no accountability under your seniority?" She leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze slicing through him like a blade. Caught between his denial and the documented evidence, Connors hesitated, his jaw working silently as he scrambled for footing. "What I mean is," he finally stammered, "it wasn't malicious. We were trying to stay proactive, to protect the neighborhood." The courtroom responded with a rising tide of mutters, forcing Victoria to level them with a single raised finger. "Proactivity does not constitute profiling," she stated plainly. "What you describe as protection has, without question, perpetuated harm." She turned her attention to Taylor, whose slouched posture made him appear smaller than he was. "Officer Taylor," she said, her voice firm but slightly gentler, "you claimed yesterday that you simply followed orders, that you didn't feel you had the authority to question your senior officer. Yet, as of this morning's submissions, your body cam identified instances in which hesitation on your part turned into silent compliance. Is that accurate?" Taylor shifted, his gaze darting between his hands and the expectant eyes of the courtroom. "Yes," he admitted quietly. His voice cracked as he added, "I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't want to get in trouble." Victoria allowed the confession to settle in the room like a stone sinking in water. Her sharp inhale was subtle but resonant enough to draw the room back into focus. "Fear of repercussion does not absolve guilt, Officer Taylor. If anything, allowing the compulsion of authority to override your ethical judgment demonstrates precisely why accountability at every level is critical." Then, leveling both officers with her unyielding stare, Victoria concluded, "Submission to a corrupted system doesn't absolve you from its consequences." A sudden sound broke the suffocating stillness. The courtroom doors creaked open, revealing Agent Harlan and another representative from Internal Affairs. They strode quickly and purposefully toward the bench, their arrival punctuated by the shuffle of papers and exchanged whispers. Whatever new development they carried, its urgency was palpable. Victoria rose slightly in her chair, her calm demeanor belying the storm brewing within. The crowd leaned forward instinctively. "Agents Harlan," she said, her voice laced with anticipation, "what additional findings have you brought to this court?" Harlan glanced at Victoria and then at the gallery. "Your Honor," they began, "the findings we've just confirmed deepen the implications tenfold. I believe it's best addressed under immediate formal review." Victoria nodded sharply. Addressing the courtroom now hanging on her every word, she declared, "This court will recess briefly to assess the validity and urgency of these proceedings. Upon return, clarity will be restored and justice will resume its path." The gavel struck again, but the atmosphere pulsed with unresolved electricity. The gallery erupted in whispers as Victoria rose and led the agents into her chambers, every eye in the house fixed on her exit. Whatever revelations loomed promised not just accountability, but an upheaval poised to recalibrate the very balance of power itself. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Victoria Mason resumed her place at the bench. The gavel's sharp strike still lingered in the room like a pulse, commanding attention and respect from every corner. Connors and Taylor currently sat motionless at their table, shadows of their former selves, under siege from new revelations and their spiraling consequences. The gallery buzzed faintly, but even among the whispers of expectation, every individual present hung onto the grip of anticipation. Knowing the walls were closing in not just on the officers, but on the larger institution of their precinct. Victoria adjusted the collar of her judicial robe slightly, then allowed her piercing gaze to sweep the entirety of the courtroom. Her voice, calm yet controlled like the edge of a relentless storm, broke the stillness. This hearing resumes under the burden of new evidence that adds weight to this investigation. Throughout these proceedings, we have sought not just accountability, but an examination of the system that allows misconduct to fester unchecked. Today will mark whether those who sit on the stand and those who stand behind them are prepared to answer for the choices they've made and ignored. Prosecutor, continue. The prosecutor, already poised with his notes, stood smoothly. Your Honor, during yesterday's recess, Internal Affairs concluded an immediate review of additional materials provided by whistleblowers within the precinct. Submitted recordings, confirmed communications, and eyewitness testimonials combined to create a deeply troubling picture, one that demonstrates not isolated misconduct, but rather systemic malpractices perpetuated and normalized by this precinct's leadership. This time, the gallery did not bother biting back its shock. A ripple of noise rushed through the air, a rising tide of anger and incredulity. Victoria raised her hand with firm authority, calling the noise to a swift end. Order in the courtroom, she demanded. This is not a forum for retaliation. Only truth finds space here. Her command redirected all focus to the defense table. Connor's face now carried a tinge of desperation, his breaths shallow as his hands clasped tightly together. Taylor, on the other hand, seemed utterly deflated, as though everything left in him had dissolved. The visible disparity between them starkly highlighted not just age and rank, but a deeper divide in culpability. The prosecutor continued, stepping closer to the jury. Given these findings, I call attention to a pattern of forced detentions targeting minority communities and individuals perceived as vulnerable. Evidence highlights numerous stops reported as routine, yet they bore no probable cause. The victims of such stops, often compliant, unarmed, and innocent, suffered unwarranted intimidation, humiliation, and in some cases, unlawful detainment. Officer Connors, as you served in a supervisory capacity, can you deny awareness of these actions under your jurisdiction? Connors lifted his head slightly, meeting the prosecutor's pointed gaze. Sweat beaded at his temple. He opened his mouth, but whatever words he hoped to form faltered. Your Honor, not every detail can be accounted for. Officers have discretion. In Victoria interjected sharply, Officer Connors, discretion does not absolve persistent abuse. You are not responsible for one mistake. You are responsible for overseeing or failing to curtail systemic violations happening under your leadership. Her voice remained steady, yet bore the same unrelenting weight as a winter gale. Answer directly. Were complaints escalated under your command dismissed either explicitly or indirectly? Connors shifted uncomfortably under the strike of her words. "You can't speak to every single incident," he muttered lamely, his voice cracking slightly. "But yes, I may have overlooked minor discrepancies in favor of bigger resolutions." The courtroom erupted again, this time briefly unable to restrain its collective voice. "Silence!" Victoria barked, her gavel punctuating the demand. "This court operates on clarity, not indignation." She shifted her focus solely onto Connors. "What you term minor discrepancies has left lives shattered and trust obliterated. Every bypass of accountability paves the way for irreversible harm. This court cannot and will not regard such justification lightly." The prosecutor resumed, honing in on Taylor now, whose shrinking figure betrayed a deep-seated pang of regret. "Officer Taylor, the court needs clarity in regard to your compliance with team expectations despite your personal reluctance. Was there any occasion in which you knowingly obeyed instructions rooted entirely in profiling without contesting the premise?" Taylor glanced momentarily at Connors, but found no reassurance there. At last, he broke eye contact altogether, finally surrendering any attempt to remain stoic. "Yes," Taylor admitted, his voice small and taut. It happens more often than it should. Back at the precinct, you stuck to what you were told, not because you wanted to, but to avoid trouble." A sharp exhale escaped from somewhere within the gallery's crowd. Heads shook, furious whispers returned, the fight to remain quiet proving too difficult for some. Others crossed their arms tightly, staring holes into the two officers. Injustice thrives on silence, Victoria said aloud, her voice impassive yet stirring. She observed Taylor for a few long moments before continuing her statement directly. You, Officer Taylor, despite your experience or lack thereof, contributed to these harms by aiding their trespass through your inaction. I understand fear of consequence, but morality demands courage. Your reasons may elicit slight understanding, but they bring no excuse. Her gaze steadied now on Connors once more. And you, Officer Connors, will acknowledge that Taylor's silence rested its foundation within your culture of control. The application of excuses stops here. The sudden appearance of internal affairs representatives jarred the courtroom again. Agent Harlan swiftly marched toward the bench, holding two stapled documents. Their movements carried purpose, and their arrival networked immediate urgency. Standing tall, Harlan addressed Victoria, but made their delivery loud enough to be caught by the audience. Your Honor, in tandem with ongoing whistleblower reports, Internal Affairs has discovered breaches far exceeding even this current case. These include manipulated evidence logs across dozens of prior investigations. They handed the documents over to the court clerk, who approached Victoria's bench. In layperson's thought, Harlan continued grimly, we're peeling back scales of corruption held deeply, not singularly. Victoria scanned the paperwork with laser-like intensity, but her face revealed no revelation other than resolve. Leaning slightly forward, she made her pronouncement sharply. This courtroom will recess yet again for further certification of the material validity brought forth. When we return, decisions will be made. Big decisions requiring unwavering weight. Order in the law, as ever, wrests away prevarication. Her words were exact. They thundered bold judgment, sending the room into hushed chaos at the promise of total revelations to come by hour's return. The courtroom resumed its charged atmosphere as the gavel struck. Victoria Mason, seated regally at the bench, let her eyes drift across the room. Each hesitant shift of a chair, every nervous cough, it all compounded the tension that gripped the air. Connors and Taylor sat subdued at the defense table, their once resolute composure slipping further into uncertainty. The gallery was packed to capacity, with listeners craning their necks, desperate not to miss history in the making. This court is back in session, Victoria began, her commanding voice resonating through the chamber. We resume under the weight of evidence that points to not just individual misconduct, but to systemic failures demanding our scrutiny. Let us proceed. Her words settled over the room like a lead blanket, heavy with implication. The prosecutor rose, an air of calculated confidence in his movements. He carried yet another folder of damning evidence, this one containing the results of a forensic audit into departmental records, a bombshell waiting to be dropped. Addressing the court, he began, Your Honor, I present findings from an audit conducted by a third-party agency. The data exposes manipulated reports, falsified stop logs, and patterns of systemic misconduct spanning years within the precinct led by Officer Connors. He paused, letting the enormity of his statement sink in. These actions weren't isolated. They weren't mistakes. They were institutionalized. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a murmur louder than any Victoria had allowed before. She raised a hand sharp and deliberate to silence the crowd. This is a courtroom, not a spectacle. Order will be maintained. Facing Connors directly, the prosecutor hammered in. Officer Connors, these records reflect stops and detainments under your watch that targeted individuals without probable cause. In some instances, names were fabricated entirely. Do you deny authorizing or participating in this? Connors' face flushed red as the room's attention zeroed in on him. Beads of sweat formed at his temple, and his voice, hoarse and strained, barely carried across the room. I don't recall any instances like that. My officers were told to follow procedure. If there were errors in logs, they were clerical. His words faltered, the excuse feeling as limp as his confidence. Victoria interjected, her calm tone laced with ferocity. Officer Connors, dismissive language such as clerical errors will not suffice here. These are not minor discrepancies. Every entry in those falsified logs represents a real person, one subjected to undue scrutiny, humiliation, or worse. Your responsibilities as a leader were clear. Will you continue denying accountability? Connors clenched his jaw, his silence more incriminating than any verbal admission. Taylor, meanwhile, looked ready to fold under the pressure, his hands clasped tightly as if physically restraining his guilt from pouring out. The prosecutor shifted his approach, turning instead to Taylor. Officer Taylor, you are new to the force, relatively speaking. We've heard your claims of deference to senior officers, of feeling pressured to conform, but this audit implicates both high-ranking and lower-level officers alike. Can you clarify, do you recognize instances when logs were falsified or stops fabricated under your watch? Taylor hesitated, his pale face nearly translucent under the courtroom lights. When he finally spoke, it was quiet but trembling with suppressed emotion. Yes. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. The room erupted again, voices clashing with disbelief and outrage. Victoria's gavel struck hard, silencing the chaos instantly. She leaned forward, her gaze pinning Taylor down. Elaborate, Officer Taylor. This court deserves clarity. Taylor trembled, swallowing hard as he began speaking. There were times when the reports didn't match what happened in the field. Stops were exaggerated. Detentions were justified after the fact, not during. I questioned it once, early on, but... He glanced nervously at Connors, whose glare attempted to silence him. I was shut down, told to get with the program. Victoria narrowed her eyes. And did you get with the program, Officer Taylor? Did you file objections? Did you push for accountability? His head hung low, barely audible as he admitted, No, Your Honor. The room was dead silent this time, the weight of his confession pressing on everyone like a vice. Victoria inhaled deeply, then steepled her fingers in front of her. Your lack of resistance, Officer Taylor, has perpetuated this cycle. Compliance in the face of corruption is complicity. Remember that as this court considers your future. The tension was shattered again as Agent Harlan entered the courtroom, their face urgent, flanked by another representative from Internal Affairs. Murmurs rippled as they approached the bench with a sealed envelope. Without a word, they handed the document to Victoria, who opened it and scanned its contents. Her expression remained stoic, but the flicker in her eyes revealed the gravity of what she read. After a long pause, she set the document down and addressed the courtroom. The content of this new submission will be reviewed in full before being brought into these proceedings. However, I will say this, what lies within these pages casts an even darker shadow over the institution in question. Rest assured, truth and accountability will prevail here. The gallery buzzed, trying to dissect her cryptic remark. Connors appeared to wither further, while Taylor looked nearly broken. Victoria struck her gavel once more. This court will recess briefly. Upon return, we will continue, for the truth waits for no one, and justice demands no delay. She rose, exiting the courtroom as the buzz escalated to a roar of speculation. Left in her wake was a room simmering with tension, awaiting what promised to be a groundbreaking conclusion. The courtroom hummed with quiet tension as the second afternoon began. Victoria Mason adjusted herself on the bench, the air around her simmering with anticipation. The developments leading up to this moment had unraveled like a slow-burning storm, and today promised nothing less than high winds to sweep away pretense. The two officers, Connors and Taylor, sat in contrasting postures, Connors rigid and defensive, Taylor slouched and remorseful. The gallery, now at capacity, included media representatives alongside community members who bore witness to what was quickly becoming a symbol of accountability long overdue. This court is back in session, Victoria said firmly, her gavel striking once to punctuate. The deliberations will now address the submissions reviewed during recess, including the new evidence provided by Internal Affairs. Our objective remains unshaken, to confront misconduct openly and resolve it through the unwavering application of justice. Prosecutor, proceed. The prosecutor rose methodically, his every movement deliberate, as if each second mattered in the shaping of this trial. Holding up another bound folder filled with evidence, he addressed Victoria and the jury with precision. Your Honor, this morning we learned of falsified evidence logs and manipulated records from the precinct in question. However, further investigation uncovered another layer of institutional betrayal. The courtroom stirred. Faces hardened, and breaths quickened as the gallery braced to hear how deep the corruption ran. These documents, the prosecutor continued, reveal an unrecorded quota system unofficially circulated among senior precinct staff, including Officer Connors. Tasked to increase detentions and citations, this initiative was directed disproportionately at low-income communities and people of minority demographics. Communication traces show undeniable evidence that such orders came from leadership within the precinct, while individual accountability was buried under bureaucracy. Victoria nodded slowly, signaling the prosecutor to elaborate. Across the room, Connors visibly stiffened, his fingers curling around the edge of the desk like a vice grip. Taylor, by contrast, buried his face briefly in his hands, the weight of corruption he had complied with seeming to press down on him physically. "Officer Connors," the prosecutor said, turning his focus sharply to the witness stand, "you were directly referenced in at least 3 emails where such initiatives were encouraged. These communications included line-by-line instructions for stops targeting vehicles with visible wear and tear and individuals matching prior suspect profiles overwhelmingly skewed against African American, Latino, and immigrant populations. Do you deny issuing or acting under such directives?" Connor's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes darted toward his defense attorney, whose whispered reassurances seemed hollow in the wake of mounting evidence. Finally, with forced composure, Connor spoke. "Your Honor, I did receive those emails, but this wasn't about discrimination. It was about effectiveness. Crime rates indicated trends, and we had to make difficult decisions based on what the data showed us." The gallery erupted in stunned disbelief and voices began to rise. Victoria struck her gavel sharply. "Order!" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Silence once again blanketed the room, thick and uneasy. Victoria fixed her gaze on Connors, her expression a mask of restrained fury. "Officer Connors," she said, "you speak of data justifying actions that targeted vulnerable populations disproportionately. Data can highlight patterns, but it cannot override the rights and dignity of individuals. Your defense suggests that dehumanization was an acceptable trade for efficiency. This court views such claims as unacceptable." Connors swallowed hard, his veneer of composure beginning to crack. Next to him, Taylor squirmed in his seat, his youthful face pale and visibly ashamed. The prosecutor didn't relent. "Officer Taylor," he said next, redirecting his attention, "as a junior officer in this precinct, were you ever required or encouraged to participate in these quota-related policies? Were stops ever incentivized directly or through implication?" Taylor hesitated, his trembling hands resting on the table as he searched for words. When he spoke, his voice wavered but carried a raw honesty. "Yes," he said haltingly. "There were times when officers were praised for hitting certain numbers. It wasn't explicitly called quotas, but everyone knew. The more stops you made, the more recognition you got. Sometimes hints were dropped to focus on areas more prone to trouble. We knew what that meant." The gallery murmured again, this time, a low, simmering boil of anger and vindication. Cameras clicked from the designated press section, though their efforts to capture the moment didn't disturb the gravity of what Taylor had admitted. "And did you comply?" the prosecutor asked directly. Taylor nodded, his head low. "I did," he choked out. "I didn't always agree, but I was scared of being seen as a problem or losing my job." Victoria's steady yet imposing voice broke the new silence. "Officer Taylor, fear may explain compliance, but it does not excuse it. Your actions and inactions contributed to harm. That is undeniable." Before the atmosphere could settle, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A uniformed bailiff stepped inside and whispered urgently to Victoria's clerk, who then handed Victoria another sealed document. She opened it carefully, her practiced neutrality slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of surprise. When she looked up again, her eyes rested on the 2 officers as if weighing their very souls. "This," she said slowly, holding the document aloft, "is a sworn affidavit from a former high-ranking precinct officer who supervised Connors directly. Its claims are staggering enough to require immediate scrutiny, yet they align with the patterns emerging in this courtroom." The gallery tensed at her words. Connors shifted uncomfortably, his expression darkening as Victoria continued in a measured tone. "It alleges direct orders crafted to inflate numbers, an initiative rooted not in necessity or justice, but in optics to secure funding and accolades. The affidavit names not just yours, Officer Connors, but others we have yet to hold accountable." A collective intake of breath rose from the gallery, filling the room with electric expectation. Victoria's tone turned stern. "We will adjourn briefly to validate the admissibility of this new evidence. Upon return, this courtroom will address its implications. Justice does not wait for comfort or convenience, and our pursuit today will be exhaustive." Dismissed. Her gavel struck hard, and as the courtroom doors swung open once more, it became abundantly clear that the system's most guarded secrets were now teetering dangerously close to exposure. The recess lingered longer than anticipated, and when the courtroom doors finally reopened, an air of foreboding swept the gallery. Conversations had dwindled into tense waiting, a shared realization sinking in that the weight of what was unfolding reached far beyond the two officers now seated at their defense table. Connors and Taylor appeared as though the fight had left them. Taylor's nervous demeanor had devolved into something like grief, perhaps for the career he believed in or the choices he failed to resist. Connors, meanwhile, maintained a hardened expression, his stoic facade cracking only under the glow of unrelenting scrutiny. Victoria Mason re-entered the courtroom with her typical poise, her movements deliberate, her face neutral but etched with the gravity of the moment. She carried the aura of someone who understood the magnitude of her decisions, not just in this trial, but for the many who would ripple outward from its verdict. As she ascended the bench, the entire room seemed to draw a collective breath, waiting for her first words. "This court is now in session," she began, her voice as calm and precise as ever. "We move forward with the review and implications of the affidavit submitted earlier. The findings within this document, alongside the evidence provided throughout the proceedings, mandate a closer consideration of not just individual actions, but department oversight. This institution has failed, and that failure reached its epitome in the actions displayed at the gas station." Her last few words hung heavily over the room, especially for Connors, whose eyes flickered briefly downward. Taylor sat frozen, the faint tremor in his hands betraying his efforts to keep himself composed. The prosecutor rose next, holding the affidavit in hand as though it were a piece of irrefutable truth. "Your Honor," he addressed the court, "this sworn testimony from Captain Ernest Hollisa, a retired officer from the defendant's precinct, goes beyond confirmation of systemic abuse. It names key players who orchestrated the quota-driven policies and reveals frank admissions of racial prejudice discussed behind closed doors." There was a collective shift in the gallery. The community leaders seated in the front row leaned forward, their faces torn between silent fury and grim vindication. The journalists furiously scribbled notes, their pens scratching over pages as though engraving history in real time. The prosecutor turned to Connors. "Officer Connors, Captain Hollis explicitly names you as one of the architects of the tactics perpetuated under your leadership. Among his claims is an incident 6 years ago, where you advocated for preemptive detainment of individuals based on identifiable suspicion, a term Captain Hollis attests to as coded language for racial profiling. Do you deny this?" Connor's jaw clenched visibly, the spotlight burning harder on him than it ever had before. He reached for the water glass in front of him, draining it in a single gulp before responding. "Your Honor, those allegations are exaggerated. Conversations happen in any profession, and I cannot control how others interpret them. Any enforcement actions we took were within the bounds of policy, nothing more." The prosecutor didn't flinch at Connors' tactfully vague response. "Let me rephrase, Officer Connors. Are you denying that these conversations took place during your supervisory meetings?" Connors hesitated, a long pause that stretched uncomfortably across the room. Finally, he looked away but muttered, "I'm not denying conversations took place." The admission sparked murmurs in the gallery, which Victoria silenced with a single glare. "Order," she commanded, her voice slicing through the heat like ice. When the room settled, she leaned slightly forward. "Officer Connors," Victoria said, her measured tone taking on a sharper edge, "each time you acknowledge these practices without dissent, every instance where bias was discussed under the guise of strategy, you placed yourself deeper into culpability. Good intentions, if indeed you claim them, cannot excuse gross misconduct." Connors shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't reply. Next to him, Taylor stole fleeting glances toward the judge, as if anticipating his own turn under the microscope. He didn't have to wait long. "Officer Taylor," the prosecutor pivoted, his tone softening just slightly but no less direct. "Captain Hollis also outlined a culture of forced compliance for junior officers, a culture you've corroborated in your testimony thus far. In light of this affidavit, do you reaffirm that you were knowingly instructed to follow, or at least turn a blind eye to, biased and unlawful practices?" Taylor looked down, silent for several beats. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his eyes glassy as he spoke. "Yes," he admitted, "it wasn't called out as bias, but we all knew. Every time we were sent to specific neighborhoods, told to stay longer, to stop more people for small infractions, it was clear." The prosecutor pressed forward. "And you complied? Regardless of what you knew?" Taylor nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did. I shouldn't have, but I did." Victoria allowed the silence that followed to linger, her expression a mixture of somber resolve and restrained ire. Then, in an even-keeled tone, she addressed both officers. Knowing wrongdoing and choosing inaction. Worse, participating makes you complicit. Lives were derailed, communities fractured, trust obliterated. You failed individually and collectively in your oaths to serve and protect. As her words settled, the bailiff entered quietly, delivering yet another sealed envelope to the bench, a subpoena from the Justice Department. Victoria opened it, her eyes scanning quickly before placing the document down with definitive affirmation. Looking up, she addressed the courtroom. This court has been informed that federal oversight into the precinct will commence immediately. This includes a full audit of past cases linked to these policies and potential criminal charges for other implicated officers. The revelations swept through the room like wildfire. Connors sagged visibly under the weight of impending investigations, while Taylor looked utterly lost, his regret consuming every corner of his expression. Victoria raised her gavel but paused, letting the tension simmer for one final moment. This trial is far from concluded. Tomorrow, we will address consequences, not just for these defendants, but for the structures that allowed their actions to persist. This court will adjourn until then. And with a resounding crack of the gavel, the session ended, but the storm brewing above the precinct was only beginning. As the gavel struck sharply once more, signaling the resumption of proceedings, the atmosphere in the courtroom had reached an almost unbearable tautness. The gallery was more crowded than ever, and the air buzzed with whispers, dampened only by the tension of anticipation. Today, Victoria Mason was about to steer the proceedings into their most consequential leg, and the nation seemed to hold its collective breath. Outside, news cameras hovered as close as they could to the courthouse entrance. Inside, Connors and Taylor sat at their defense table, their faces pale and worn beyond their years, consumed by the weight of their choices and the revelations that seemed to tighten around their necks like a noose. Victoria settled herself at the bench, her sharp gaze slicing through the room. Her judicial robes, immaculately pressed, seemed almost ceremonial today, as if her presence alone embodied the gravity of the occasion. She spoke, her voice low but steeped in authority. "This court is back in session," she began, her tone smooth but unyielding. "As we proceed, let me remind all present that our priority is to protect the integrity of this courtroom and, most importantly, the truth we have sworn to uncover. Justice is not revenge, but it will be relentless." The prosecutor wasted no time, rising from his seat with a purposeful confidence. In his hands, he carried a slim bundle of papers, a physical manifestation of a mounting case against not only these officers, but the deeply rooted structural rot they represented. Addressing Victoria, he said, "Your Honor, as deliberations resume today, I request the court's attention on three core aspects of this investigation that demand further scrutiny: the falsified reporting practices, the live corroboration from officers being interviewed under federal review, and most significantly, new audio recordings directly implicating not just these defendants, but higher precinct leadership." A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Too soft to interrupt, but too loud to ignore. Victoria gave them a single sharp glance, silencing any voices before they swelled. "Proceed," she instructed, her tone brooking no interruption. The prosecutor nodded and turned toward the jury, his voice rising in measured confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, throughout this trial we have established patterns of excessive force, systemic bias, and fabricated justifications used repeatedly within this precinct. While these defendants stand as individuals before the bench, the evidence we will review this afternoon shifts the lens further onto an institutional failure so profound that it undermines public trust itself." He moved forward, positioning himself closer to the front of the courtroom. "This first audio recording comes from an anonymous source inside the precinct," he said, as he gestured for the clerk to begin playing the file. The sound crackled to life almost immediately, a grainy but incriminating discussion among officers, one of whom unmistakably sounded like Connors. "This is how we keep numbers up," one voice said, heavy with conviction. "It doesn't have to be anything big. Small infractions are better. They don't fight them as much, and it pushes the stats we need." There was a pause, and then Connor's voice was heard, clearer now. "Exactly. No one's gonna notice some kid being held for jaywalking or noise complaints. It's clean and it justifies the extra presence." The recording ended abruptly, but the atmosphere it left behind swallowed the room whole. No one moved, no one even seemed to breathe. Connor sat frozen, his face twisting as if trying to fight off the wave of horror crashing over him. His attorney leaned close, whispering furiously in his ear, but it was clear from Connor's sagging posture that any defense they could muster would be wholly insufficient. It was Taylor, though, who appeared even more visibly shaken. He leaned forward, elbows digging into the table as his hands trembled, buried in his face. Victoria's voice cut through the tension, her controlled deliberation the only thing keeping the courtroom tethered to order. "Officer Connors," she said, her tone razor-sharp, "your voice on this tape removes all ambiguity regarding your involvement in the perpetuation of unlawful and prejudicial practices. Do you still contend that your actions reflected sound judgment and lawful procedure?" Connors raised his head slowly, his composure fraying at its edges. "Your Honor," he began with a rasp, "in one of this was ever supposed to happen like this. We never thought about it that way. We were under pressure." "Pressure is never justification for violating the oath you swore to uphold." Victoria's words landed with crushing weight, and no amount of pressure can excuse targeting vulnerable communities under the guise of strategy. The prosecutor stepped forward again, this time focusing on Taylor. "Officer Taylor, you have previously stated that you followed orders out of fear, that questioning authority within this precinct was not an option. Now that we have heard this recording, do you refute the justification offered by your superior?" Taylor's lip quivered as he gave his answer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't refute it, but to wish I had stood up back then." His admission seemed to ripple across the room like shattered glass. Even Victoria paused, her response laden with melancholy despite the firm edge it retained. "Officer Taylor," she began, her sharp yet solemn tones silencing whispers before they could even form, "regret, while necessary to growth, does not undo harm. The path forward demands more from you than retrospective guilt." Before the gravity could fully settle, the courtroom doors creaked open once more and a young officer stepped inside, clutching another folder of evidence. He handed it briskly to the clerk, who passed it to Victoria. She opened it, her expression sharpening as her eyes scanned the page. "This document," she announced after a moment, "is a finalized report from Internal Affairs confirming the dismissal of multiple other staff members from this precinct based on the evidence surfaced in this case." She raised her eyes to Connors and Taylor, her voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "The tide has turned. Dismissal is only the beginning. Tomorrow, this court will issue its penultimate rulings on consequences, not just for individuals, but for the broken systems that enabled them." She struck the gavel firmly, the sound reverberating through the courtroom, leaving the gallery and the defendants alike frozen in its wake. The day was over, but tomorrow promised the reckoning to truly begin. The courtroom was silent as Victoria Mason entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. The gravity of the previous day's revelations lingered heavily in the air, creating a palpable tension. Every gaze turned toward the judge, each person anticipating the reckoning they knew was imminent. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd of protesters and supporters clamored for justice, their chants muffled but present in the background like a distant heartbeat of the community's anger and hope. "This court is now in session," Victoria began, her voice resolute, her gavel striking with a sound that echoed throughout the chamber. "Today we address not only the actions of Officers Connors and Taylor, but the systemic failures that allowed such misconduct to thrive unchecked. Let it be known, this courtroom will tolerate no evasions and no deflections. The truth will be heard." The gallery was packed, the tension so thick it felt like a living entity pressing down on everyone in the chamber. Connors sat at the defense table, his face pale, his hands clasped tightly together as though grasping for some semblance of control. Taylor, seated beside him, looked drained, his shoulders hunched under the weight of remorse and culpability. Their defense attorney whispered hurriedly to them, but neither seemed to absorb the words. Agent Harlan from Internal Affairs approached the bench with a crisp efficiency that betrayed no emotion. "Your Honor," Harlan began, addressing Victoria directly while ensuring the audience could hear, "as of this morning, the Justice Department has escalated its involvement. A federal inquiry into the precinct and its leadership has been formally opened, with subpoenas issued to multiple high-ranking officials within the department. This inquiry extends beyond these proceedings and into systemic practices revealed during this trial." The murmurs in the gallery swelled to a low roar before Victoria's sharp glance and a strike of her gavel restored order. "This is a courtroom," she said firmly, her gaze sweeping the room, "not a forum for speculation. Respect the process." The room fell silent again. The prosecutor rose next, his movements deliberate, his voice clear and unrelenting. Your Honor, over the course of these proceedings, we have seen overwhelming evidence of misconduct. We have heard the voices of victims, read accounts of systemic bias, and listened to admissions from the defendants themselves. Today, we present the final piece of this puzzle, a comprehensive summary of complaints filed over the last 5 years, which were systematically dismissed or buried by the chain of command. A thick file was handed to the court clerk, who delivered it to Victoria. She opened it and began scanning the contents, her expression unreadable. The gallery remained deathly quiet, every spectator holding their breath as they awaited her response. After what felt like an eternity, Victoria looked up from the file. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of undeniable authority. This document reveals a pattern of intentional suppression, false reporting, and abuse of power. Individuals within the precinct took active measures to protect themselves at the expense of justice. The perpetrators targeted vulnerable populations, eroding trust and devastating communities. These actions, or lack thereof, represent a gross betrayal of public service. Her gaze shifted to Connors, whose face had gone ashen. Officer Connors, she said, her words deliberate and sharp. As a senior officer, your role was to lead with integrity. Instead, you chose to perpetuate harm. Your actions and inactions are documented in detail within this file. These are not allegations, they are facts, corroborated by evidence and testimony. What do you have to say in your defense? Connors opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. He looked to his attorney, who gestured for him to remain silent. Finally, with visible effort, he managed a response. Your Honor, I made mistakes. Mistakes I regret deeply. But, his voice faltered as he struggled to find the words. But I wasn't the only one. The entire system was broken. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Yes, Officer Connors, the system is flawed. But systemic failure does not absolve individual accountability. You benefited from that broken system while others suffered because of it. That is the reality before this court. Her voice was calm but carried a cutting edge that left no room for rebuttal. Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, drawing Victoria's attention. Officer Taylor, she said, her tone softening slightly, you have admitted your compliance, your silence, and your fear of challenging the status quo. And while that fear may be understandable, it does not excuse complicity. Do you have anything further to add before this court renders its judgment? Taylor's hands trembled as he clasped them together. He swallowed hard, his voice barely audible as he spoke. I'm sorry, he said, his words choked with emotion. To the people I hurt, to Miss Mason, I'm sorry. I should have done better. I should have been better. His confession hung heavy in the air, drawing silent reactions from the gallery, some empathetic, others coldly unforgiving. Victoria allowed the moment to linger before speaking again. Acknowledgement of wrongdoing is the first step, Officer Taylor, but accountability requires more than words. This court will consider your remorse, but it does not erase the harm caused. Before adjournment, the prosecutor addressed the court once more. Your Honor, given the systemic nature of this case and the revelations brought to light, we request that sentencing recommendations include provisions not only for punitive measures, but for systemic reform initiatives within the precinct and broader community. Victoria nodded, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. This court will reconvene tomorrow to deliver its final rulings and recommendations. Let it be clear, justice does not end with punishment. It demands change. The gavel struck and the session ended, leaving the room buzzing with the weight of what had just unfolded. Outside, the chants of the protesters grew louder, carrying the echoes of a community that refused to be silenced. Justice was near, but its full reckoning was yet to come. In the packed courtroom, a hush lingered, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers and the muffled protest chants filtering faintly through the walls. All eyes were fixed on Victoria Mason as she approached the bench with measured precision, her every step resonating with the weight of the moment. It was the final day, the climax of a trial that had become a symbol for accountability and justice. The air crackled with tension, the unspoken awareness that today would bring closure or igniting change. This court is now in session, she declared, her voice calm but commanding as she raised her gavel and struck it firmly, silencing even the faintest murmurs in the gallery. After deliberation on the evidence presented, the testimonies heard, and the systemic failings revealed, this court will now render its decision. Taylor sat nervously at the defense table, his hands trembling as they rested in his lap. Connor sat beside him, still as stone, his face pale and lined with resignation beneath the weight of the preceding days. Both men had surrendered any illusions of vindication. The overwhelming evidence left no cracks to crawl through. What lingered on their faces was the question of severity, the extent to which their failures and choices would shape their punishment. Victoria began, her voice as precise as the ticking of a courtroom clock. "Officer Taylor, this court recognizes your admission of compliance and regret. Your confession and acknowledgement of the wrongdoing you perpetuated, while significant, do not outweigh the harm. You failed to exercise the moral courage required of you, compounding the injustice faced by the victims of your inaction. However, the court also considers your lesser role and the coercive environment under which you operated. As such, you will be stripped of your position as a law enforcement officer, effective immediately. Furthermore, you are sentenced to probation under strict conditions and mandatory participation in a reformative justice program." Taylor's head dropped, the soft intake of his breath audible even amongst the sea of bodies surrounding him. Shame was written in every deliberate movement as his hands clenched together tightly, likely weighing the balance between relief and regret. Attention quickly shifted as Victoria's gaze fell on Connor's. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the intensity of her focus enough to make the room draw an instinctive breath. "Officer Connors," she began, her tone steely, "as a senior officer, you are held to the highest standard of accountability. Not only did you fail to meet this responsibility, but you actively perpetuated and reinforced systemic failures within your department. Your actions manipulating logs, orchestrating targeted enforcement policies, and ignoring ethical considerations constitute not only negligence, but willful misconduct." She took a measured pause, letting her words sink in before continuing. "This court, therefore, sentences you to dismissal from your position with dishonorable discharge. Additionally, you will serve an 18-month sentence in prison for abuse of power and falsification of official records. Upon your release, restrictions on public service employment will be enforced indefinitely." The gallery came alive with a hum of mixed emotions, muted gasps, whispers, the faint shuffle of seats. Victoria's raised gavel brought swift silence once more, a reminder that the process, though nearing its conclusion, still demanded full attention. This trial, however, was never solely about these two individuals. They are products of an institution steeped in failure, a system that fostered their actions, ignored accountability, and harmed the communities it was sworn to protect. True justice cannot stop at individual accountability. It must extend to the structures that enabled these injustices to thrive. She turned her gaze first to Agent Harlan and then to the front row, where community leaders listened intently. With oversight from the Justice Department, Victoria continued, addressing the audience as much as those seated before her. "This precinct will be subject to a comprehensive review. Practices, protocols, and personnel will be examined. Those implicated in perpetuating unethical behavior will face consequences. Funds forfeited from the precinct's budget under misconduct will be redirected to community rebuilding programs, education initiatives, and resources for those victimized by these practices." Her voice rose slightly, each word driving forward with the energy of finality. "Above all, it is imperative to remember this. Justice is not a destination. It is a practice, one that requires vigilance and active participation from everyone, officers, leaders, and citizens alike. Today is not the end. It is only a beginning." As the courtroom absorbed her words, the sound of muffled chanting grew louder, swelling as though in synchrony with the verdict. "Justice now, justice always." The community, growing in number outside, answered her statement with a demand for continued accountability. Victoria stood, her composure unshaken yet visibly weighted from the events of the past days. "This trial is officially adjourned," she concluded, striking the gavel firmly one last time. As she exited through the heavy oak doors, the world beyond the courtroom awaited her. The reporters' questions, the protesters' cries, and the hopeful faces of those who stood firm for justice loomed large. But for Victoria Mason, it wasn't about the noise, it was about the quiet resolve in her chest, the certainty that today had been a step forward, however small, toward a better system. One conversation, one courtroom, one ruling at a time.